The silence lasted 4 full seconds. I counted them, the way I count everything, because counting is what I do when the room is about to change shape and I need somewhere to put my hands. 1. Eleanor Whitfield's wine glass, halfway to her lips, frozen there like she'd forgotten what a mouth was for. 2. My father-in-law Walter setting down his fork with a small, precise click, the sound a man makes when he already knows the next 30 seconds are going to cost him something. 3. My wife Camille's face, going through 4 expressions in the space of a breath: confusion, recognition, dread, and something underneath all of it that I hadn't seen from her in 11 years of marriage. Something that looked almost like relief. 4. The waiter, standing at the head of the table with his hands folded in front of him, waiting for me to tell him whether he should keep going. I told him to keep going. My name is Marcus Hale. I'm 36 years old. I own a private investment and hospitality holding company out of Boston, and 40 minutes before that silence, my mother-in-law had looked me dead in the eye, in front of 11 members of her extended family, and told them all that I had married above my level. That Camille had done something generous, something almost charitable, by letting a man like me put a ring on her finger. She said it with a smile. She said it like it was a compliment to her daughter and not a knife pointed directly at my chest. She had no idea that the restaurant we were sitting in belonged to me. She had no idea that the waiter standing at our table had been trained, personally, in how to handle situations exactly like this one, because I had written the policy myself 18 months earlier after a different kind of bad night. She had no idea that in about 4 seconds, her whole understanding of who I was, and who her daughter had actually married, was going to come apart at a dinner table in front of everyone she'd invited to watch her humiliate me. But before I tell you what the waiter said, I need to tell you how we got to that table. Because the story of that night doesn't start with an insult. It starts 11 years earlier, with a woman who fell in love with a man her family had already decided wasn't good enough, and it ends with all of them finding out exactly how wrong they'd been the entire time. Before we get into it, if you're the kind of person who believes quiet people can still win the room, hit subscribe now, because this channel exists for stories exactly like this one, and we've got a lot more coming. Part 1, The Kid from Fall River. I grew up in Fall River, Massachusetts, in a house my parents rented for 22 years because they never had the down payment to buy it. My father worked as a machinist at a fabrication shop that made parts for commercial fishing boats. My mother cleaned offices downtown starting at 5 in the morning, before most of the people whose desks she wiped down had even woken up. We didn't have money. We had routine, and discipline, and a kitchen table where my father taught me to play chess with a set missing 2 pawns, which he'd replaced with a couple of old checkers pieces because buying a new set felt wasteful when the old ones still technically worked. I tell you that not because I want sympathy. I've never wanted sympathy in my life, and I didn't want it that night at the restaurant either. I tell you that because it matters for what comes later, because everything Eleanor Whitfield thought she knew about me started and ended with the zip code I was born in, and she never once bothered to look past it. I was good at 2 things growing up, numbers, and not complaining. Both of those turned out to be useful. I got a partial scholarship to UMass Dartmouth for finance, worked 2 jobs to cover the rest, and graduated with a degree and almost no debt, which by the standards of the people I grew up around made me practically rich already. I took an entry-level analyst job at a regional investment firm in Providence, worked there for 6 years, learned everything I could about distressed assets and undervalued commercial real estate, and at 28 I left to start my own thing with $11,000 in savings and a business plan I'd written on a legal pad during my lunch breaks. That $11,000 became Hale Meridian Group. Over the next 8 years, Hale Meridian bought failing restaurant properties, tired hotel assets, and underperforming commercial real estate across New England, restructured them, and either sold them or held them as income properties. By the time I sat down at that dinner table with the Whitfields, Hale Meridian controlled 41 properties across 4 states, including and this part matters, a hospitality division that owned 6 restaurants, one of which was the private dining room inside a members club called the Windermere, on the 3rd floor of a converted textile building in Boston's Back Bay. The same Windermere where Eleanor Whitfield had booked her sister's 70th birthday dinner without knowing a single thing about who actually owned the building she was sitting in. I met Camille Whitfield 11 years ago, at a charity gala for a children's literacy foundation in Boston. I was 25, newly out on my own, wearing a rented tux that didn't quite fit through the shoulders. She was 24, a graduate student in art history at Boston University, wearing a green dress that made her look like she belonged in a painting rather than standing in front of one. I didn't know, when I introduced myself, that her father owned one of the oldest private wealth management firms in New England, that her mother sat on 4 different museum boards, or that the Whitfield name had been attached to Boston old money since before the Civil War. I just knew she laughed at the joke I made about the terrible hors d'oeuvres, and that she asked me real questions instead of the polite, empty ones people usually ask at those events. What do you actually do all day? What made you start your own company instead of staying somewhere safe? What are you afraid of? Nobody had ever asked me that last one at a party before. I found out who her family was 3 weeks into dating her, when she casually mentioned her father's firm during a phone call, and I remember sitting on the edge of my bed in my 1-bedroom apartment in Somerville, doing the math in my head, understanding for the first time exactly what kind of world she'd grown up in compared to the one I was still climbing out of. I almost called it off before it started. Not because I doubted how I felt about her, but because I already had a decent sense of how her family would feel about me, and I'd spent enough of my life being underestimated that I wasn't sure I had the appetite for more of it from people I'd have to see at every holiday for the rest of my life. Camille talked me out of that particular fear on a phone call that lasted almost 2 hours. My family isn't the whole world, she told me. And you don't owe them an audition. I believed her. I want to be honest and say I still believe she meant it, every word, even though it took her family considerably longer than either of us expected to actually act like it was true. The first time I met Walter and Eleanor properly, at a dinner Camille arranged 4 months into our relationship, at their house in Weston, I wore the only suit I owned that fit well, and I brought a bottle of wine I'd researched carefully for 2 days beforehand, trying to find something that would read as thoughtful without looking like I was trying too hard. Eleanor took the bottle at the door, glanced at the label for exactly 1 second, said how lovely, and set it down on a side table in the foyer, where it stayed, unopened, for the entire evening. I noticed. I don't think she meant for me to notice, or maybe she did I've never fully decided which is worse. Dinner that first night set the template for the next 11 years almost perfectly. Walter asked what my father did, and when I told him, machinist, he nodded slowly in a way that had already filed the information and moved on before I finished the sentence. Eleanor asked where I'd gone to school, and when I said UMass Dartmouth, she said, "Oh, that's a fine school," with the specific emphasis people use when they mean the opposite and want credit for restraint anyway. I remember driving home that night with Camille, and she was furious on my behalf, more furious than I was, honestly, because I'd already braced myself for exactly that evening before it happened. "They'll come around," she said, gripping the wheel a little too hard. "Once they actually get to know you." I nodded, because I loved her, and because at 25, I still believed that kind of thing could be true if you just gave people enough time and enough evidence. We dated for 2 years before I proposed. In that time, I met her parents somewhere close to 24 times, and in nearly every one of those encounters, I felt the same specific chill the sense of being evaluated and quietly found insufficient. Walter Whitfield would ask me about my business with the tone of a man humoring a child's drawing. Eleanor Whitfield would ask me where my family summered, and when I told her we didn't summer anywhere, we worked, she would smile the smile she perfected over decades of country club luncheons and say, "How resourceful," in a voice that made resourceful sound like a diagnosis. Camille saw it. She apologized for it constantly, in the early years. "They'll come around," she'd say. "They just need time." 11 years is apparently not enough time. We got married at a small vineyard in the Berkshires, 60 guests, nothing extravagant, because I paid for most of it myself and I've never believed in spending money to impress people who were never going to be impressed regardless. Eleanor cried during the ceremony, and for a long time I let myself believe those were happy tears. I know now they weren't. I know now, because of things Camille told me much later, that Eleanor had spent that entire wedding quietly telling her sisters that she gave the marriage 5 years, maybe 7, before Camille came to her senses. We just passed our 11th anniversary. Part 2, 11 years of small cuts. I want to be precise about something, because precision matters to me and it mattered to how I eventually handled all of this. The Whitfields never did one big, dramatic, cinematic thing to me across those 11 years. If they had, it would have been easier. You can point at one big wound and say, that, right there, that's the moment everything broke. What they did instead was smaller and much harder to fight, because each individual moment was deniable on its own. It was death by 1,000 polite paper cuts, delivered over holiday dinners and birthday parties and Sunday brunches, for over a decade. It was Walter introducing me at his law partner's retirement party as Camille's husband, he's in real estate, when Hale Meridian's most recent acquisition, a boutique hotel property in Newport, had closed at $14.2 million 2 weeks earlier, a deal Walter absolutely knew about, because Camille had told him herself, excited, the way she always was when she talked about my work to people who never seemed to care. It was Eleanor, at Thanksgiving, asking me in front of the entire extended family whether I'd thought about getting into something more stable, for Camille's sake, as though I were still living paycheck to paycheck in a walk-up apartment instead of running a company that, by that point, employed 63 people. It was Camille's cousin Whitney, at a 4th of July party at the Whitfields' Nantucket house, a house I had never once been invited to stay overnight in, despite 11 years of marriage, always given the excuse that the guest cottages were already booked, asking me, with a smile that had clearly been passed down through generations of exactly this kind of smile, whether it was hard, being the practical one in the marriage, the one who kept things grounded while Camille came from such an accomplished family. Practical. Grounded. Resourceful. I collected those words over the years the way some men collect scars. Every one of them meant the same thing underneath the manners, you don't belong here, and we all know it, and we're simply too well-bred to say it directly. The worst part wasn't the insults themselves. I'd grown up around men who threw punches, I could have handled punches. The worst part was that Camille almost never pushed back in the moment. She'd get quiet. She'd change the subject. Later, in the car, she'd apologize, sometimes cry, tell me her parents were impossible, tell me she loved me, tell me it would get better. And I believed her, because I loved her too, and because loving someone means you keep extending credit even after the account's gone into overdraft more times than you can count. I never asked her to choose between me and her family. I want to be completely clear about that, because it matters for what happened later. I never once told Camille to cut off her parents, never gave her an ultimatum, never made her pick a side. I absorbed it instead, the way I'd absorbed things my whole life, because I genuinely believed that if I built enough, achieved enough, proved myself capable enough, eventually the Whitfields would run out of reasons to look down on me. What I didn't understand back then, and what I understand very clearly now, is that people like Eleanor Whitfield don't look down on you because of what you have or don't have. They look down on you because looking down on someone else is the entire architecture of how they understand their own worth. There is no accomplishment large enough to fix that, because the problem was never actually about my accomplishments. It was about her need for a hierarchy with her family sitting comfortably at the top of it. I kept building anyway. Not to prove her wrong, or not only for that. I built Hale Meridian because I loved the work, because turning something broken into something functional has always felt like the truest form of satisfaction I know. But somewhere in the back of my mind, yes, there was a small, quiet part of me that kept score. That noted every slight. That filed each one away without deciding what, if anything, I'd ever do with the file. One incident from those years still sits with me clearer than the rest, maybe because it was the first time I understood exactly what kind of comparison I was always being measured against. 3 years into the marriage, at a Christmas party at the Whitfield house, Eleanor introduced me to a family friend, a man named Preston Ashcombe, the son of one of Walter's law school classmates, who'd inherited a controlling interest in his family's commercial insurance brokerage and, from what I could tell in about 4 minutes of conversation, had never once had to build anything from scratch in his life. Eleanor lit up around him in a way I'd genuinely never seen her light up around me. Preston was actually one of Camille's first serious boyfriends, she told me, apparently under the impression this was charming small talk rather than a small, deliberate cruelty. We always thought the two of them made such sense together. Similar backgrounds, you know. It's easier that way. I stood there holding a glass of eggnog I didn't want, watching Eleanor talk to Preston about his family's boat, and I understood, with total clarity, that this wasn't really about money at all. Preston's brokerage, by Camille's own account later that night, was actually doing worse financially than my company was at the time. €, carrying debt, coasting on his father's old client relationships, barely profitable. None of that mattered to Eleanor. What mattered was that Preston had been born already standing where Eleanor believed a person was supposed to stand. I hadn't been. No amount of profit and loss statements was ever going to change which side of that particular line Eleanor had already drawn me on. I didn't say anything to Eleanor that night. I did say something to Camille in the car, quietly, without much heat in it, just an observation. Your mother introduced me to your ex-boyfriend tonight like she was still hoping you'd trade up. Camille didn't defend her mother that time. She just reached over and held my hand the rest of the drive home, and I remember thinking, that's something, at least. It wasn't enough. But it was something. That file got very full on the night of Eleanor's sister's 70th birthday dinner. If you've ever sat at a family dinner and felt smaller with every course, you already know exactly where this story is going. But stick with me, because the ending is not the one they were expecting, and I promise you it's worth the drive to get there. Part 2.5, $11,000. I think it's worth actually telling you how Hail Meridian started, because the number gets thrown around a lot in this story. $11,000, and I don't want it to just be a detail I mention in passing. I want you to understand what that number actually meant, and what it cost to turn it into something else. I had $11,000 saved by the time I was 28, after 6 years working as an analyst at a regional investment firm in Providence, living in a studio apartment above a laundromat, eating the same rotation of 5 cheap dinners for most of that decade, putting away nearly every dollar I could after rent and groceries. I wasn't investing in the market during those years, not really. I was investing in myself, in the sense that every dollar I didn't spend was a dollar closer to being able to leave a steady paycheck behind and bet on my own judgment instead. The first property Hail Meridian ever acquired was a boarded-up laundromat/diner combination in New Bedford, a building the bank had already written down twice, that I bought for $38,000 using my $11,000 as a down payment and a small, high-interest loan from a private lender who mostly worked with contractors nobody else would touch. Camille came with me to see it, before we were even engaged, and I remember her standing in the middle of that gutted, water-damaged space, cracked linoleum under her heels, and instead of looking horrified, the way I half expected, the way her mother absolutely would have, she looked around slowly and said, I can actually see it. What you're describing. I can see it. That was the moment, more than any gala, more than any proposal, when I knew I wanted to spend my life with her. She saw the finished version of something when all the evidence in front of her said it was broken. I gutted that building myself on weekends for 4 months, alongside 2 guys I paid in cash and pizza more often than actual wages, because I couldn't afford both. I slept some nights on a cot in the back office because driving home to Somerville and back felt like wasted time I didn't have. When it reopened as a small commercial laundry service with an attached CAFA copyright, it was profitable within 5 months, and I sold it 11 months after that for $104,000, not because it wasn't working, but because I needed the capital more than I needed to keep operating one small property, and because I'd already learned the thing that would define the next decade of my career. I was better at fixing broken assets and moving on than I was at running any single business forever. I want to tell you honestly that none of those first years felt triumphant while they were happening. They mostly felt like exhaustion. There were months I wasn't sure Hail Meridian would survive. A deal in Fall River that nearly wiped out my working capital in year 3, a lawsuit from a contractor that cost me 8 months of legal fees and sleepless nights in year 4, a stretch in year 5 where I genuinely considered folding the company and going back to a salaried job, just for the stability of a predictable paycheck. Camille talked me through most of those nights. She never once suggested I quit, even during the worst stretches, even when it would have made both our lives measurably easier in the short term. She believed in the finished version of things the same way she had, standing in that gutted New Bedford laundromat, years before either of us knew how much it would eventually be worth. By the time Hale Meridian acquired the Solane Restaurant Partners portfolio, including the Windermere, I'd already survived enough near collapses that the deal itself, as large as it was, didn't feel as terrifying as it probably should have. I'd learned to trust the process by distressed, restructure with discipline, staff with people who actually cared about the outcome instead of just collecting a paycheck, and be patient enough to let the fix actually take hold before judging whether it worked. It's the same process, honestly, whether you're talking about a boarded-up laundromat in New Bedford or a struggling four-property restaurant group in Boston. Broken things aren't usually broken beyond repair. They're usually just broken in ways nobody's bothered to look at closely enough to understand. None of that history was visible to Eleanor Whitfield when she looked at me across a dinner table and decided, within the first few months of meeting me, that she already understood everything worth knowing. She saw a kid from Fall River in an ill-fitting suit and she stopped looking. She never asked about the laundromat, or the cot in the back office, or the 8 months of legal fees that nearly buried the company in year 4. She asked where my family summered, and when the answer didn't fit the story she already believed, she filed me under resourceful and moved on, and kept moving on, for 11 years, without ever once updating the file. Part 3, The Windermere. The Windermere Club occupies the top 3 floors of a restored textile mill in Boston's Back Bay, all exposed brick and steel frame windows and a private dining room on the 3rd floor with a view down toward the Charles River. Membership runs $18,000 a year, plus a $12,000 initiation fee, and the waiting list, when I originally acquired the property through Hale Meridian's hospitality division, had a 3-year backlog of applicants trying to buy their way into exactly the kind of exclusivity the Whitfields have spent their whole lives believing they were born into. I bought the Windermere 2 years before that dinner, as part of a broader acquisition of a struggling hospitality group called Solane Restaurant Partners, which had overextended itself building 4 high-concept restaurants in 18 months and nearly collapsed under its own debt. Hale Meridian took an 82% controlling stake in Solane for $9.6 million, restructured its debt, replaced 2/3 of its management, and within 14 months had it operating at a healthy margin across all 4 properties, the Windermere included. I don't advertise that ownership. That's not modesty it's strategy. When you own hospitality assets, especially private clubs that trade on the illusion of belonging to an untouchable inner circle, the last thing you want is for the members to know the man who greets them at the door on a Tuesday also happens to hold the deed to the building. It changes how people behave. It makes the staff nervous. It turns every dinner into a performance. So outside of my executive team, almost nobody knew Marcus Hale had anything to do with the Windermere Club. Camille didn't know either. Not because I was hiding it from her specifically she knew about Hale Meridian's hospitality division in general terms, the way a spouse knows the broad shape of your work without tracking every deal but the Solane acquisition had closed during an unusually quiet stretch when we were both buried, her in a major museum acquisition project, me in due diligence, and it simply never came up in a way that stuck. I'd mentioned it once, in passing, over dinner. She'd nodded, distracted, and the conversation moved on to something else. That's the honest truth of it. It wasn't a secret. It just never mattered enough, in the moment, to repeat. Which meant that when Eleanor Whitfield chose the Windermere Club to host her sister Patricia's 70th birthday dinner because it's the only place with the right kind of people, she told Camille on the phone, not realizing Camille would repeat that line to me later, nearly word for word she had absolutely no idea she was hosting her family's celebration inside a building I controlled, staffed by employees who reported, several layers up an org chart, directly to me. The dinner was scheduled for a Saturday evening in October. 11 guests, Walter and Eleanor, Patricia and her husband, 3 of Eleanor's other siblings and their spouses, Camille's brother Grant and his fiancée copyright E, and the 2 of us. I almost didn't go. I'd had a rough week a deal in Providence that fell through at the last minute, costing us nearly 4 months of work and the idea of spending a Saturday night absorbing Eleanor's particular brand of hospitality-adjacent contempt felt like more than I had in me. But Camille asked me to come, and I could hear in her voice that she needed me there, so I put on a suit and I went. I want to tell you honestly that I had no plan that night. I wasn't walking into that dinner looking for a confrontation, and I certainly wasn't walking in planning some elaborate reveal. I'd simply gotten so used to being underestimated by that family that I mostly just tuned it out, the way you tune out traffic noise after you've lived next to a highway long enough. I was there for Camille. That's all. Everything else that happened because Eleanor Whitfield decided, on that particular Saturday, that she'd had enough wine and enough of an audience to finally say out loud what she'd apparently been thinking for 11 years. Part 4, The Dinner. We arrived at 7. The private dining room on the 3rd floor had been set with the good china, the kind reserved for members hosting events over a certain budget threshold, and a floor-to-ceiling window view of the city lights coming up gold against the October dark. I knew the room. I'd been in it exactly twice before, both times for Hale Meridian investor dinners, both times without Camille, both times without anyone at that table recognizing me, because the staff who worked those events were briefed in advance and instructed to treat me like any other guest unless I said otherwise. Camille didn't know that either. Which meant that when we walked in and the Maasai Trade, a sharp, composed woman named Priya who absolutely knew exactly who I was, greeted us with a warm, entirely professional, "Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. Hale, right this way," Camille assumed it was simply good service. I let her assume that. It genuinely hadn't occurred to me, in that moment, that the evening was about to require Priya's discretion in a much bigger way than either of us expected. Dinner started fine. Patricia was in good spirits, telling stories about her early career as a hospital administrator, and for the first 30 minutes I actually thought we might get through the night without incident. I talked briefly with Grant Svienka copyright a genuinely kind woman named Sophie who worked in non-profit development and asked me real questions about Hale Meridian the way Camille had, all those years ago, at that literacy gala. It felt, for half an hour, almost normal. Then, over the appetizer course, one of Eleanor's other sisters, Diane, asked Camille how the museum acquisition project was going, and Camille lit up talking about it, the way she always does when she's genuinely excited about her work. A Rothko the museum had been trying to secure for its permanent collection for almost 3 years. Diane listened, nodded, said all the right things, and then turned to me and asked, in the specific tone people use when they're not actually curious, "And what is it you do again, Marcus?" Camille's mentioned it, but I always forget. "I run an investment and hospitality holding company," I said. "Hale Meridian Group." "Oh, how nice," Diane said, already turning back toward Camille, the conversational equivalent of a door closing. Walter picked it back up a few minutes later, over the second course, asking me how the little real estate thing was going, and Eleanor laughed not unkindly, at first, just the reflexive laugh of a woman agreeing with her husband's framing of things. And something in me went quiet and still, the way it always does right before I decide I'm done letting something slide. "It's going well," I said, keeping my tone even. "We're closing a hotel acquisition in Newport next month, actually. 14 million. 14 million, Patricia's husband repeated, somewhere between impressed and skeptical, the way people repeat a number when they're deciding whether to believe it. 14 million, I confirmed. Walter made a small, non-committal sound, the kind that means I heard the number and I'm choosing not to be impressed by it, and turned back to Patricia's husband to ask about his golf handicap. I let it go. I'd let it go 100 times before. "It's going well," I said. "We closed a $14 million acquisition in Newport last quarter." Walter made a small, non-committal sound, the kind that means I heard the number and I'm choosing not to be impressed by it, and turned back to Patricia's husband to ask about his golf handicap. I let it go. I'd let it go 100 times before. It was over dessert, with the wine having gone around the table 4 or 5 times by then, that Eleanor decided to make the evening memorable. Patricia had just finished a story about how she and Eleanor grew up summering on the Cape, back when it was still full of the right families, before everyone could just buy their way in, and the table laughed the specific laugh of people who find their own nostalgia very charming, and then Eleanor turned, deliberately, toward me and Camille. "Speaking of families," Eleanor said, swirling her wine, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry to the whole table, "I still remember when Camille first brought Marcus around. Do you all remember? I told her then," I said, "Camille, darling, you have to understand, you're marrying quite a bit above his level. It's not his fault, of course. Some people just aren't given the same starting line. But I do think it says something wonderful about Camille, don't you? That she saw past all that." There was a pause. The kind of pause where you can feel a room deciding whether to laugh or to look at their plates. A couple of Camille's aunts did the second thing. Walter did the first thing, a short, dry chuckle, more out of habit than genuine amusement. Grant looked mortified. Camille went white. "Mom," Camille said, her voice tight. "Don't." "What?" Eleanor said, all wide-eyed innocence, the performance of a woman who has said something cruel enough times to have perfected the art of pretending she doesn't understand why it landed that way. "I'm complimenting you, darling. I think it's admirable, honestly, marrying someone from such different circumstances. Not everyone would be so generous." Generous. There was that word's cousin again, the one I'd been collecting for 11 years, except this time it wasn't tucked inside a backhanded compliment at a holiday dinner. This time it was said loudly, at a table of 11 people, in a room I owned, by a woman who genuinely believed she was being gracious. I felt the old, familiar tightness start in my chest, the one I used to just breathe through and swallow. But something was different this time, and it took me a second to understand what. I think it was simply that I was tired. 11 years tired. Tired in a way that had finally crossed some threshold where staying quiet stopped feeling like patience and started feeling like complicity in my own diminishment. "Married above my level," I repeated, keeping my voice level, almost conversational. "Well," Eleanor said, with the air of someone being asked to explain something obvious to a slow child, "I only mean the Whitfields have been part of this city's fabric for generations. Camille grew up with certain advantages. And you've done well for yourself, Marcus, truly, I'm not saying otherwise. But there's a difference between doing well and belonging somewhere. I think it's important we're honest about that, don't you?" I looked around the table. Walter was studying his dessert plate with great interest. Patricia looked uncomfortable but wasn't saying anything. Camille had her hand on my arm under the table, gripping it hard enough that I could feel her nails through my sleeve, whether in warning or solidarity I genuinely couldn't tell in that moment. "I appreciate the honesty," I said, and I meant it, in the strange way you can mean something while also knowing it's the last thing that person expected you to say. "Let's be honest about a few more things, then, while we're at it." I caught Priya's eye across the room. She'd been standing near the service station the entire time, close enough to have heard every word, and something in my expression must have told her exactly what I needed, because she was already walking toward our table before I'd raised a hand. If you've ever felt like the room was quietly deciding you didn't belong, stay with me, because what happened next is the part everyone at that table still talks about, whether they want to or not. Part 5, The Waiter. Priya reached the table and stood at the head of it, the way well-trained staff do when they're about to address the whole group rather than a single guest. She had the kind of composure you can't train into someone in a week. It takes years of learning to deliver difficult information in a way that sounds, on the surface, entirely pleasant. "Mr. Hale," she said, "I apologize for interrupting. I wanted to check whether you and Chef Antoine would like to do the private tasting tonight, the way you usually do when you're in the building. He's got the new autumn menu ready and he specifically asked if you'd be here this weekend, since ownership hasn't had a chance to review it yet. I want you to understand what happened at that table in the 3 seconds after Priya said the word ownership." Eleanor's wine glass stopped halfway to her mouth. Walter set down his fork with a small, precise click. Patricia's husband, who golfed with 3 different members of the Windermere's board and clearly understood exactly what ownership meant in that sentence, went very still. Grant Svianka copyright Sophie's eyebrows shot up. And Camille €, Camille's face went through confusion, then recognition as she connected pieces I hadn't realized she'd been holding separately in her memory, then something that looked almost like she wanted to laugh, and underneath all of it, that flicker of relief I mentioned at the start of this story. The relief of a woman who has spent 11 years watching her husband absorb blow after blow without complaint, finally seeing the ground shift under the people who'd been throwing them. Ownership, Eleanor repeated, very quietly, like the word had a strange taste. Yes, Priya said, entirely pleasantly, entirely professionally, with absolutely no idea €, or perhaps every idea €, of the grenade she just placed in the middle of the table. Mr. Hale is the majority owner of Solane Restaurant Partners. The Windermere's part of the group. We don't usually make a thing of it with members, he prefers to keep a low profile, but since you asked about the tasting menu, I figured €1. That's all right, Priya, I said, and I let a small, easy smile settle onto my face, the first genuinely relaxed expression I'd had all night. Tell Chef Antoine I'll come by the kitchen before we leave. We can save the full tasting for another night. Tonight's about Patricia. Of course, Priya said, and with a small nod she was gone, back toward the kitchen, entirely unaware €, or entirely aware, I've never been sure which, and I've never asked €, that she'd just detonated 11 years of accumulated condescension in about 11 seconds flat. The table was silent. I let it stay silent for a moment, the way I let silences sit in negotiations, because silence does more work than almost any sentence I could construct. I should clarify something, I finally said, keeping my voice as calm and unhurried as I could manage, because I've learned that the angrier the truth, the more devastating it lands when delivered quietly. 2 years ago, Hale Meridian Group €, that's my company, the one you've been calling the little real estate thing, Walter €, acquired an 82% controlling stake in Solane Restaurant Partners for $9.6 million. Solane owns 4 restaurant properties in Boston, including this one. I don't come in and micromanage the day-to-day, that's what Priya and the general managers are for, but yes, technically, I own the building we're currently sitting in. I own the kitchen your dinner came out of. I own, more or less, the chair you're sitting on. Nobody said anything. I say all that not to embarrass anyone, I continued, though we both know that wasn't entirely true, but because you just spent the last several minutes telling this table that I married above my level. That Camille did something generous, letting a man like me into this family. I want to make sure everyone understands the actual math, since we're being honest tonight. Hale Meridian currently manages 41 properties across 4 states. Last year, the company did just under $61 million in revenue. I employ 63 people directly, plus close to 400 more across the hospitality division. I didn't inherit any of it. I built every piece of it starting with $11,000 I saved working 2 jobs through college, because my father was a machinist and my mother cleaned office buildings starting at 5 in the morning, and neither of them ever had the luxury of a trust fund or a family name to open doors for them. Eleanor's face had gone from pale to a deep, uncomfortable red. Marcus, I didn't mean €. I know exactly what you meant, I said, and for the first time in 11 years, I let her hear that I knew. You've meant it every single time you called me resourceful. Every time you asked if I'd thought about a more stable career while I was closing 8-figure deals. Every time you introduced me as Camille's husband, he's in real estate, instead of using my name. I've absorbed all of it for 11 years because I loved your daughter and I didn't want to make family gatherings harder for her than they already were. Tonight, you did it in front of 11 people, in a room I happen to own, and I decided I was done pretending it doesn't land. This is absurd, Walter said, finding his voice, though it came out thinner than his usual courtroom register. There's no need to make a scene. I'm not making a scene, Walter, I said. I'm sitting here, at a normal volume, correcting a factual error your wife made in front of your family. If it feels like a scene, I'd gently suggest that's because the truth is uncomfortable, not because I raised my voice. Eleanor, to her credit €1, or perhaps to her detriment, depending on how you look at it €1, wasn't quite ready to fully surrender the field yet. I don't see why the size of your company changes anything about what I said, she tried, her voice a little unsteady but still reaching for its usual authority. Money isn't the only measure of whether people belong together, Marcus. There are other things. Background. Values. The way people were raised. I agree completely, I said. So let's talk about values, then, since you brought it up. My father worked the same factory floor for 31 years so that I could go to college without debt. My mother started her shift at 5 in the morning for 2 decades so there'd always be food on our table, and neither of them ever once complained about it in front of me, because complaining wasn't a value they believed in passing down. I was raised to build things, to finish what I start, and to treat people with respect regardless of what they can do for me. I'd genuinely like to know which part of that you think disqualifies me from this family, Eleanor, because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like exactly the kind of background you'd want for your daughter's husband. Eleanor didn't have an answer for that. She opened her mouth, and then closed it again, and I watched something in her expression shift €1, not quite defeat, but the recognition that the ground she'd been standing on for 11 years had just been pulled out from under the argument itself, not merely the financial details she hadn't known about. I think, Patricia said quietly, breaking the silence, clearly uncomfortable being anywhere near the center of a conflict at her own birthday dinner, that we should probably let this go for tonight. That's fair, I said. I'm sorry for the interruption to your evening, Patricia. This isn't how I wanted your birthday to go either. I'll say one more thing, and then I'm happy to move on completely. I looked at Eleanor, and I made sure my voice stayed level, because the point I wanted to land needed to land clean, without heat riding underneath it. I'm not upset that you didn't know about the Windermere. I'm not even really upset about tonight specifically. I'm tired, Eleanor, after 11 years, of being the acceptable exception in a family that still believes where someone comes from tells you something true about what they're worth. Camille didn't marry above her level. She married someone who was raised to believe worth is built, not inherited. I'd have said all of this without owning this building. Tonight just happened to be the night I stopped being quiet about it. If you've ever had someone underestimate you right up until the moment the facts caught up with them, drop a comment below €1, because this is exactly the kind of reversal we love telling on this channel, and there's a lot more where that came from. Part 6. What Camille said. Camille hadn't spoken since Priya walked away from the table. I could feel her next to me, very still, and I genuinely didn't know, in that moment, which direction she was going to go. 11 years of watching her go quiet during these exact kinds of moments had trained me not to expect a rescue. I braced myself for the familiar pattern €1, the change of subject, the quiet apology in the car later, the small, tired retreat. That's not what happened. Camille set down her napkin, folded it once, and looked at her mother with an expression I had genuinely never seen on her face before. Not anger, exactly. Something colder and more finished than anger. Mom, she said, I need you to actually hear this, because I don't think you have, not once, in 11 years. Marcus didn't marry above his level. If anything, I've spent this entire marriage watching him be more patient with this family than any of us deserved. You've made him feel small at every single holiday for over a decade, and I let it happen because I told myself you'd eventually come around, and I was embarrassed, honestly, of how long it was taking me to say something. Camille €1, Eleanor started. I'm not finished, Camille said, and something in her tone made even Walter go quiet. You didn't know he owned the Windermere. Fine. That's not really the point, and I think you know that. The point is that you were comfortable saying he married above his level whether he owned this building or not, because to you, it was never actually about money. It was about where he came from. And I'm done sitting quietly while you say that about the man I've built a life with. Patricia, to her credit, reached over and put a hand on Eleanor's arm, a small, quiet gesture that seemed to say enough, now, let it go. Eleanor didn't shake it off, but she also didn't say anything else. For possibly the first time in her adult life, Eleanor Whitfield appeared to have run out of things to say at a dinner table. Diane, the sister who'd asked me minutes earlier what it was I did again, was staring at the tablecloth like it had personally betrayed her. Patricia's husband, the one who golfed with the Windermere's board members, cleared his throat and said, mostly to fill the silence, "Well, Antoine's tasting menu really is remarkable. If you haven't tried it, Eleanor, you should let Marcus arrange it sometime," which struck me as such an absurd thing to say in that moment that I almost laughed, and I think Sophie caught my eye and had the same thought, because she pressed her napkin to her mouth to hide a smile. Grant, Camille's brother, finally spoke, quietly, mostly to me. "For what it's worth, Marcus, I've never thought that. I've always thought Camille got lucky." He paused, glancing at his mother. "I've thought that for a long time, actually. I just never said it out loud, because it felt like it wasn't my place to correct Mom in front of everyone. I should have. I'm sorry I didn't." "Thank you, Grant," I said, and I meant it. It was the first time in 11 years anyone in that family had said something like that to my face, unprompted, without it being wrung out of them by circumstance. Sophie, who barely knew me, who had every reason to stay quiet in a family dispute that wasn't hers, spoke up too. "For what it's worth, from an outsider's perspective, you built a $60 million company from $11,000 and 2 jobs. I don't think, above your level is the phrase anyone should be using here." Grant looked at his fiancée copyright like he'd just fallen for her a little more, right there at the table, and honestly, I understood the feeling. We finished dinner. I want to be clear about that, because I think it says something about the kind of person I've tried to be throughout all of this. I didn't storm out, I didn't demand an apology in front of everyone, I didn't turn the rest of the night into a performance of my own. Patricia's birthday didn't deserve to be swallowed by her sister's mistake. We stayed for coffee. We sang happy birthday. I made polite conversation with Sophie about her non-profit work. Underneath the surface, though, the entire architecture of that family's understanding of me had shifted, permanently, and everyone at the table knew it, including maybe especially Eleanor. We didn't talk about it again that night. Camille and I got in the car, and she cried, not the way she usually cried after these dinners, the tired, defeated kind, but something that felt more like release. I held her hand across the console the whole drive home, and neither of us said much of anything, and that was fine. Some conversations need the quiet after them more than they need more words in the moment. Part 6.5, The Fallout Spreads. Word travels fast in a family like the Whitfields, and it travels even faster when there were 11 witnesses in the room, and at least 3 of them were the kind of people who text their own group chat before the valet has even brought your car around. By Sunday morning, less than 12 hours after Patricia's birthday dinner ended, Camille's phone had 31 unread messages, most of them from cousins and aunts who hadn't even been at the table, all of them wanting the story secondhand. Camille's cousin Whitney the same one who'd once asked me, at that Nantucket 4th of July party, whether it was hard being the practical one in the marriage, texted her directly, "Is it true Marcus owns the Windermere?" Aunt Eleanor is furious, apparently she hasn't left her room since brunch. Camille showed me the message with an expression somewhere between exhausted and amused. I didn't respond to any of it. It wasn't my fight to manage secondhand, and honestly, I'd already said everything I needed to say at the table itself. Walter called Camille on Sunday afternoon, not to relitigate the dinner, but to ask, quietly, almost sheepishly, whether the $14 million Newport deal was real, or whether I'd exaggerated it in the heat of the moment. Camille told him it was real, that in fact I'd undersold it slightly, that the actual figure once you counted the associated property improvements was closer to 16. Walter was quiet on the phone for a long moment before saying, "I had absolutely no idea," which Camille later told me was probably the most honest sentence her father had said to her in years. There was, predictably, a little bit of professional fallout too, though not the kind you might expect. A regional business publication that covers New England hospitality and real estate had been circling a profile piece on Hale Meridian's Solane acquisition for months, and somehow I have my suspicions about which of Eleanor's friends made a phone call, though I've never confirmed it. A reporter got wind of a colorful story involving the Windermere Club and a family dinner and reached out to my communications director asking if I'd be willing to comment. I declined. Some victories don't need a wider audience than the one that was actually there to witness them, and dragging Eleanor through a business publication for something that happened at a private family dinner felt like exactly the kind of scorched earth overreach I'd promised myself, on the drive home that night, that I wasn't interested in. What did change, quietly and permanently, was how people in Camille's extended social circle treated me at the handful of events we still attended together over the following months. There's a particular kind of attention that comes with being reintroduced to people who've spent a decade filing you under a specific, dismissive category, and then suddenly having to refile you somewhere else entirely. I found it mostly uncomfortable. If I'm honest, the sudden warmth felt less like genuine correction and more like recalibrated self-interest, people realizing the man they'd been politely ignoring for years turned out to control assets they might someday want access to. I was polite to all of it. I trusted very little of it. Part 7, What I Did Next. I didn't do anything dramatic in the days that followed. I want to be honest about that, because I know some of you are expecting the part of the story where I torched the family business or pull some elaborate financial revenge. That's not what this is, and frankly, I've never believed that kind of scorched earth response actually accomplishes anything beyond making the person doing it feel powerful for about a week. What I did instead was smaller, and I think more permanent. The following Monday, I called Priya and told her that going forward, any reservations made by anyone with the last name Whitfield should be handled exactly the way they'd handle any other members. Full courtesy, full professionalism, no special ownership disclosures, no special treatment either way. I wasn't going to bar them from the club or make things uncomfortable. That's not who I am, and more importantly, it wasn't what Camille needed. She needed her family to know the truth, not to watch her husband weaponize a restaurant against her mother out of spite. What I did do was stop absorbing. That was the real shift, and it had nothing to do with the Windermere at all. The following Thanksgiving, when Eleanor made a comment smaller this time, more careful, but still there, some remark about how nice it was that I'd found my footing I didn't let it pass. I said, calmly, Eleanor, I found my footing about 15 years ago. I think what's changed is that you finally noticed. She didn't have a response for that either. Camille and I talked, really talked, in the weeks after that dinner, about the pattern we'd let run for over a decade. She told me things I hadn't fully understood that she'd internalized some of her mother's snobbery herself, early in our relationship, and had spent years unlearning it quietly, ashamed to admit how deep it had gone. She told me she'd started, without telling me, pushing back on her parents more over the past year, small moments I hadn't noticed because I'd stopped expecting her to. The dinner at the Windermere wasn't the beginning of her defending me. It was the loudest, most public moment of something that had already started changing underneath the surface. Walter called me 2 weeks later, which surprised me more than almost anything else that happened. He asked if I wanted to get lunch, just the two of us, no agenda. We met at a diner in Cambridge, not anywhere fancy, which I suspect was deliberate on his part. A small, unspoken acknowledgement that the Windermere probably wasn't the right setting for this particular conversation anymore. He ordered a coffee and a turkey club and didn't say much for the first 10 minutes, which was unusual for a man who built a career on being comfortable filling silences in a courtroom. Finally, he set down his cup and said, I want to say something, and I'd like you to let me get through it before you respond, because I've been rehearsing it for 2 weeks and I'll lose my nerve if you interrupt. I told him to go ahead. I've spent 30-some years building a certain idea of what it means to have arrived somewhere, he said. Firm name on the door, membership at the right clubs, children who marry into families that look like ours on paper. I inherited most of that idea from my own father, and I never once stopped to ask whether it actually meant anything, or whether I was just repeating something because repeating it was easier than examining it. When Camille brought you home the first time, I looked at you and I saw a kid from Fall River, and I decided, before you'd said more than a few sentences to me, that I already knew everything I needed to know. I was wrong. I've been wrong for 11 years, and worse, I let Eleanor's version of wrong become the family's version of wrong, because it was simpler than pushing back on my own wife at my own dinner table. He apologized, in his own stiff, lawyerly way, for years of treating my work as smaller than it was, for the little real estate thing comments, for the golf handicap deflections every time I mentioned a deal. He told me that Eleanor had grown up with a very specific, very rigid idea of what success was supposed to look like, passed down from her own mother, a woman I'd never met but who Camille had described to me once as even worse than Mom, if you can imagine that, and that he'd let it go unchallenged for longer than he should have because it was easier than fighting about it at home. "I'm not asking you to forget any of it," Walter said. "I don't think that's realistic, and honestly, I don't think you should. I'm asking whether there's room, going forward, for me to actually get to know you instead of the version of you I invented 11 years ago." "There's room," I told him, and there was. It wasn't a perfect apology. But it was real, and it was more than I expected, and I respected him more for offering it than I had in the previous 11 years combined. We talked for another hour after that, about the Newport deal, about his own early years building his firm from a two-person office above a dry cleaner in the 70s, and I learned, somewhat to my surprise, that Walter Whitfield hadn't always been born standing where Eleanor believed people were supposed to stand either. He'd just spent 40 years letting everyone forget that, including himself. Eleanor never apologized directly. She's not built for that, I think, and I've made a kind of peace with it. What changed instead was quieter. She stopped making the comments. She started, slowly, over the following year, asking actual questions about Hail Meridian at family dinners €, not out of genuine curiosity, I suspect, so much as self-preservation, but I'll take functional civility over performed contempt any day of the week. Part 8, 6 months later. 6 months after that dinner, Hail Meridian closed its largest deal to date €, a $22 million acquisition of a struggling boutique hotel group with properties in Newport, Portland, and Providence, restructuring debt and bringing all 3 properties back to profitability within the first year. It was the kind of deal that, 4 years earlier, would have taken me 8 months of due diligence and a dozen investor meetings just to get financing lined up. This time, it took 6 weeks, because the reputation Hail Meridian had built made lenders and sellers alike willing to move fast on my word alone. That's a different kind of currency than the one Eleanor had spent her whole life measuring people by, but it's the one that actually built everything I have. Camille came to the closing dinner, held, appropriately enough, in the private room at the Windermere. My whole executive team was there Priya included, who by that point had been promoted to general manager of the entire Solane portfolio, a promotion she'd more than earned, dinner reveal notwithstanding. Camille stood up partway through the evening, glass in hand, and told my team, in front of everyone, that she was married to the most capable person she'd ever met, and that she was sorry it had taken her own family so long to see it. "I used to think loving Marcus meant managing everyone else's discomfort about him," she said. "I understand now that it actually meant standing next to him and saying so, out loud, the first time it mattered. I'm sorry it took me 11 years to figure that out. I'm glad I finally did." My father, who'd driven up from Fall River for the closing dinner because I'd insisted, stood near the window afterward with a glass of sparkling water he's never been much of a drinker looking out at the same city lights that had been behind Eleanor's head the night she called me resourceful for the 100th time. "You did all this," he said, not quite a question. "Every bit of it started with what you and Mom taught me," I told him, and he waved a hand like he didn't quite believe that, though I think some part of him did. "If you've stuck with the story this far, you already know it doesn't end with fireworks it ends quieter than that, and I think that's actually the more satisfying version, so stay with me, because there's one more conversation that mattered more than the dinner itself." I ran into Eleanor at a museum gala about a year after the dinner, one of the events Camille had helped organize as part of her work. Eleanor approached me, alone, which she'd never done before in 11 years she'd always spoken to me through Camille, or through the group, never one-on-one. "I owe you an apology," she said. "A real one. Not the version I gave at Thanksgiving." "I appreciate that," I said, and I did. "I think I built my whole life around a certain idea of what mattered," she continued, "and I never let myself notice that the idea might be wrong, because noticing that would have meant admitting I'd spent decades being unkind to people who didn't deserve it. You didn't deserve it, Marcus. I'm sorry it took me this long to say so. I didn't need that apology by that point. I'd already built the life I wanted, with the woman I loved, and Eleanor's approval had stopped being something I was chasing a long time before that gala. But I'll admit it mattered anyway, in a smaller, quieter way than I expected not because it changed anything about who I was, but because it closed a loop that had been open for over a decade. Part 8.5, The Engagement Party. I want to tell you about one more dinner, because I think it's the one that actually proved whether anything had really changed, or whether the Windermere night had just been a temporary embarrassment the Whitfields would quietly paper over once enough time passed. Grant and Sophie got engaged the following spring, about 8 months after Patricia's birthday dinner, and Eleanor insisted on hosting the engagement party at the house in Weston this time, not the Windermere, which I noticed and which I think was deliberate on her part, a small attempt to reset the board on ground she still controlled. I'll admit I went into that party with my guard up in a way I hadn't in years. Eleanor had gone quiet after the museum gala apology, but quiet isn't the same as changed, and I'd been burned enough times by that family's version of an olive branch to know the difference mattered. The party was, on the surface, lovely. Sophie's parents came up from Connecticut, warm, unpretentious people who ran a small chain of hardware stores, and I watched Eleanor greet them with the exact same practiced warmth she'd once used on me, and I found myself waiting, almost against my will, for the moment it would curdle into something smaller. It never quite did, not that night, though I noticed a few flickers a slightly too long pause when Sophie's father mentioned he'd never gone to college, a reflexive how resourceful that Eleanor caught herself halfway through saying and swallowed before it fully left her mouth. I noticed. Camille noticed too. She caught my eye across the room during that exact swallowed sentence, and something passed between us not triumph, exactly, more like the quiet satisfaction of two people watching a pattern finally start to break under its own weight. Later that night, Eleanor found me on the back porch, where I'd stepped out for air and a moment away from the crowd. She stood next to me for a while without saying anything, looking out at the dark yard. I almost said it again tonight, she finally admitted. To Sophie's father. I caught myself right before it came out, and I stood there for a second not sure what to say instead, because I genuinely didn't have another sentence ready. Isn't that strange? 30 years of having exactly one thing to say to people like that, and when I finally decided not to say it, I didn't know what else there was. What did you end up saying? I asked. I asked him how he built the business, she said. And do you know, it was actually interesting. He started with one store and a loan from his brother-in-law. Not so different from you, I suppose. She paused. I don't know why it's taken me this long to find that interesting instead of beneath me. I didn't have a tidy answer for her, and I didn't try to manufacture one. Some conversations don't need a resolution, they just need to have happened honestly, and that one had. We stood on the porch a while longer, not saying much else, and when we went back inside, Eleanor introduced me to one of Sophie's aunts as my son-in-law, Marcus, who built an incredible company from absolutely nothing, and it was the first time in 11 years I'd heard her introduce me without a qualifier attached, without he's in real estate or how resourceful trailing behind it like a small, practiced asterisk. It wasn't everything. But it was real, and 11 years had taught me to notice the difference between real and performed, and this, finally, read as real. Part 9, What I Actually Learned. Looking back on that dinner now, I don't think about it as the night I humiliated my mother-in-law, even though I know that's how a lot of people would frame it, and honestly, how a lot of you watching this are probably framing it too. I think about it as the night the truth simply became too big to keep quiet inside good manners anymore. I never set out to prove Eleanor Whitfield wrong. I built Hale Meridian because I loved the work, because coming from nothing teaches you a particular kind of hunger that doesn't fully go away even after you've made it, and because my parents taught me that dignity isn't something other people hand you, it's something you build with your own hands whether anyone's watching or not. If Eleanor had said the exact same thing to me 11 years earlier, at that first Christmas party, with none of it landing the way it did that night at the Windermere, I think I would have absorbed it exactly the way I absorbed everything else back then. Quietly, privately, filed away for a night alone with my own thoughts and no real outlet. What changed wasn't the insult. What changed was 11 years of accumulated weight finally meeting a moment where staying silent no longer felt like strength. It felt, for the first time, like agreement. That's the part one think most people miss when they hear a story like this one and file it under rich guy humiliates snob at dinner. The reveal about the restaurant was almost incidental. It was the specific mechanism that happened to be sitting there that night, the particular lever within reach. If I hadn't owned the Windermere, if Priya hadn't walked over at exactly that moment, I still would have said something. Maybe it would have taken a different shape. Maybe it would have just been the sentence I finally said out loud regardless of what building we were sitting in. I built everything I have with my own two hands, and I am done letting you tell this family a version of my life that erases every bit of that work. The ownership reveal made it undeniable in front of a room. But the actual turning point had already happened days, months, maybe years before that dinner, quietly, inside me, without anyone at that table noticing. What that dinner actually taught me is something simpler, and I think more useful than a story about a fancy restaurant reveal: the people who tell you that you married above your level, that you don't belong at the table, that you're lucky just to be included. Those people are almost never actually talking about money. They're talking about a hierarchy they need to believe in because it's the only thing propping up their own sense of worth. You cannot out-earn that belief. You cannot out-achieve it. The only thing that actually changes it, if it changes at all, is time, and consistency, and eventually, someone at the table deciding they're done staying quiet on your behalf. For 11 years, I was that quiet person. I told myself I was being patient, being the bigger person, protecting Camille from more family conflict than she needed. Some of that was true. But some of it, if I'm honest, was also fear. Fear that if I pushed back, I'd become the difficult one, the aggressive one, the confirmation of every low expectation the Whitfields already had about a kid from Fall River. There's a particular trap in that kind of fear, one I think a lot of people watching this probably recognize. You start believing that staying quiet is proof of your own maturity, your own restraint, your own class, when really it's just proof that you've accepted someone else's terms for how much space you're allowed to take up in a room. It took 11 years and one particularly careless sentence from Eleanor, at a table inside a building I happen to own, for me to finally understand that staying quiet hadn't been protecting anyone. It had just been letting the insult repeat, year after year, uncontested, and teaching an entire family that it would never cost them anything to say it again. I think about Camille's silence in those years too, and I want to be fair to her here, because it would be easy to tell this story as though she simply failed me for a decade and then heroically redeemed herself in one dinner. That's not quite honest either. Camille grew up inside that hierarchy. She was taught, from childhood, that keeping the peace at her parents' table was itself a kind of love, a kind of loyalty, and unlearning that took her longer than either of us wanted it to. I don't think her silence, in those years, was cowardice so much as it was inherited instinct, the same instinct Walter admitted to me over turkey clubs in Cambridge. That it's easier to let an old, familiar cruelty run its course than to be the one who finally interrupts it out loud, especially when the person saying it is your own mother. What changed for Camille wasn't a single dramatic realization. It was watching me absorb it, dinner after dinner, year after year, and slowly running out of ways to justify her own silence as something other than complicity. I'm not telling you to go by the restaurant your in-laws are humiliating you in. Most of us don't get a reveal that clean, and honestly, you shouldn't need one. What I am telling you is that the value of the work you build, the family you came from, the road you took to get where you are. None of that needs anyone else's permission to count. Not your mother-in-law's. Not anyone sitting across a dinner table deciding, out loud, whether you belong there. The people who ask you to prove your worth over and over, at every holiday, for over a decade, were never actually planning to be satisfied by the proof. They were testing whether you'd eventually agree with them. The only real victory is refusing to. Camille and I are approaching our 12th anniversary now. Things with her family are better than they've ever been, not perfect, but real, in a way they weren't before. My parents came up from Fall River last month for a barbecue at our house, and my father stood on the back deck, looked out at the yard, and said, quietly, "Never thought a kid with a chess set missing 2 pawns would end up here." I told him he taught me everything that actually mattered, and I meant it. Not the money. Not the properties. The patience to build something real, and the willingness, eventually, to stop apologizing for having built it. Eleanor came to that barbecue too, actually, which is its own small proof of how much had shifted. She sat at our kitchen table with my mother for the better part of an hour, and at some point I walked past and caught the tail end of my mother explaining how she used to time her office cleaning route so she could be home before I woke up for school, and Eleanor was listening, really listening, the way she'd never once listened to me describe my own childhood across 11 years of holiday dinners. I don't know exactly what shifted in her that made her capable of hearing it now when she hadn't been before. Maybe it just took watching her own daughter finally draw a line she couldn't argue with. Maybe some people only learn to actually see someone once the stakes of not seeing them become impossible to ignore. I've stopped needing to understand exactly why it changed. I'm just glad, for Camille's sake as much as my own, that it did. I think about that 4-second silence at the Windermere sometimes, the one I counted out at the very start of all this. Eleanor's wine glass frozen mid-air, Walter's fork set down with that small, precise click, Camille's face moving through confusion and recognition and dread and relief, Priya waiting for permission to keep talking. 4 seconds isn't very long. But it's long enough, it turns out, for an entire decade of accumulated silence to finally decide it's done being quiet. I ran into Preston Ashcombe, of all people, at an industry mixer in Boston about 2 years after the dinner. The same Preston Eleanor had once introduced me to at Christmas as the man she'd always thought made more sense for Camille. His family's insurance brokerage had finally been quietly absorbed by a larger regional firm the year before, the kind of acquisition that happens when a company has spent a decade coasting on inherited relationships instead of building new ones, and Preston, to his credit, was gracious about it when he brought it up himself. "Funny how things go," he said, shaking my hand. "I always had the head start." Guess it turns out the head start was the whole strategy. I told him I was sorry to hear about the acquisition, and I meant it. There was no satisfaction in it for me, none of the vindictive pleasure you might expect from a story like this one. Preston hadn't done anything to me. He'd just been a name Eleanor used as a measuring stick, the same way she'd used my background as one, and neither of us had ever really been in competition with each other outside of Eleanor's imagination. That's the part one keep coming back to, honestly, more than the reveal at the Windermere, more than Eleanor's face going pale, more than any of it. The whole 11-year conflict had never actually been between me and Camille, or even entirely between me and Eleanor. It had been between me and an idea, an inherited, untested belief about what worth is supposed to look like, who's allowed to have it, and who has to spend a decade proving it before anyone bothers to ask a real question. Ideas like that don't get defeated with a single dramatic dinner, no matter how satisfying the dinner is to tell afterward. They get worn down, slowly, by people who simply keep building, keep showing up, and keep refusing to accept the smaller version of themselves that other people have already decided is the whole story. If this story hit home for you, if you've ever sat at a table and felt smaller than you actually are, if you've ever been told, directly or otherwise, that you married above your level, got lucky, don't quite belong, I want you to hear this clearly: the table doesn't get to decide your worth. You already built that, long before you sat down. Drop a comment below and tell me about the moment someone finally found out they'd underestimated you, the family dinner, the office meeting, the phone call that changed how someone talked to you afterward. I read every one of them, and honestly, they're half the reason this channel exists in the first place. And if stories like this one mean something to you, hit subscribe, because we're just getting started, and there are a lot more tables like this one still to turn over. Thank you for spending this time with me. Take care of yourselves, hold your own worth with both hands, and never let a dinner table, or a mother-in-law, or a waiter's slip of information, or anyone else's idea of where you're supposed to fit, convince you that you don't belong exactly where you've built yourself to be.